Recently, while scrolling through Twitter and Reddit, I've noticed a significant increase in hateful comments directed at India and Indians. While some of the criticism might have valid roots in real societal issues, a large portion of this negativity seems to be driven by racial prejudice and, in some cases, even a fascist-like mindset. This made me wonder, why is India so often the target of such animosity? What is it about India that attracts such strong negative reactions from certain people or groups? One of the key reasons is that hating on India is particularly convenient. Compared to other racial or ethnic groups, Indians often lack the institutional and societal protections that shield others from hate. For example, hate against Jewish people is clearly labeled as anti-Semitic. Discrimination against black communities is understood as racism, and prejudice against Muslims is termed Islamophobia. But when it comes to Indians, there isn't a widely recognized term that defines the hatred they face. This lack of linguistic and societal recognition makes it socially acceptable to mock, criticize, or belittle Indians without fear of significant backlash or consequences. When there are no strong labels or terms that protect a group, it becomes easier for people to target them without worrying about the moral or legal repercussions. It's almost as if hating Indians is seen as an easy form of prejudice that doesn't carry the same weight as other forms of discrimination. In fact, if you look at many online forums, you'll find that hate speech directed at Indians is much more prevalent and normalized than hate speech directed at other marginalized groups. This lack of societal pushback allows people to express and perpetuate these harmful stereotypes without feeling the same kind of shame or guilt they would if they targeted other groups. The situation gets even worse in online spaces, where anonymity gives people the courage to say things they wouldn't dare say face-to-face. In these echo chambers, where accountability is minimal, Indians become easy targets. There's a widespread tendency to dehumanize Indians in online conversations, mocking everything from their accents to their cultural practices and even their economic status. This mockery is often disguised as humor, but the underlying tone is one of disdain and disrespect. In these digital spaces, hatred directed at Indians is often amplified and normalized, creating a cycle where more people feel comfortable expressing prejudice against them. Worse still, platforms like Twitter and Reddit reward this kind of inflammatory content with increased visibility, which keeps the cycle going and makes it even harder to break. Another significant factor fueling this hatred is the role the media plays in shaping global perceptions of India. India, as one of the world's fastest-growing economies and home to nearly 1/7 of the global population, is constantly under the media microscope. While this gives India visibility on the global stage, it also means that the country is often portrayed in a negative light. Media outlets tend to focus on India's poverty, corruption, and public health crises, which are all very real issues. But the problem is that these issues are not unique to India. Many developing countries face similar struggles. The difference is that India, because of its size and prominence, becomes the focal point for global attention when it comes to these challenges. Smaller or less visible countries with similar problems often remain out of the spotlight, meaning their struggles don't get the same level of scrutiny. This overexposure magnifies India's problems and creates a one-dimensional narrative that paints the country as a place of endless suffering and inequality. While India has made remarkable strides in various fields such as technology, science, and space exploration, these achievements often get overshadowed by negative media portrayals. The constant focus on India's challenges rather than its successes feeds into a stereotype of India as a backward nation, reinforcing negative perceptions that make it easier for people to dehumanize Indians. But the issue goes beyond just media portrayal. There's also a deeper, more insidious aspect at play, using India as a scapegoat to bolster the sense of superiority in other nations. Some countries and cultures actively focus on India's flaws in an attempt to make themselves feel better by comparison. For example, in China, there's a widespread stereotype that any woman traveling to India is at risk of being sexually assaulted due to India's significant issues with gender inequality and violence against women. This stereotype is often used to suggest that Chinese society is safer and more progressive by comparison. However, this narrative conveniently ignores some serious gender issues within China itself, such as the legalized trafficking of women in rural areas or the impact of policies like the one-child policy, which has led to significant gender imbalances and has caused problems of its own. Similarly, some Western countries highlight India's poverty and social issues, which is certainly a valid area of concern, but conveniently gloss over their own problems. Wealth gaps, homelessness, and exploitation of workers are common in many Western societies, yet these issues are often overlooked or downplayed when discussing their own progress. The focus on India's poverty allows these nations to deflect attention from their own shortcomings and present themselves as morally superior or more advanced. By focusing on India's problems, they distract from their own domestic challenges. This phenomenon of pointing fingers at India to elevate one's own sense of moral or cultural superiority is deeply hypocritical. While it's true that India faces numerous challenges, so do many other countries. Yet, the difference is that these nations are often quick to condemn India while refusing to look at their own systemic issues with the same critical eye. By turning India into a convenient scapegoat, they avoid dealing with their own flaws and, in some cases, even perpetuate stereotypes that undermine the dignity of an entire nation. There's the issue of a double standard when it comes to the tolerance of hate. In many parts of the world, it's considered unacceptable to openly express racism, antisemitism, or Islamophobia. These are terms that people recognize and condemn, and there are societal norms in place to prevent such hate from spreading unchecked. But when it comes to Indians, the same level of protection doesn't exist. Indians are often seen as fair game for ridicule, their accents, cultural practices, and even their very identity reduced to punchlines and jokes. This tolerance for anti-Indian sentiment reflects a broader failure to recognize prejudice when it's aimed at groups that don't have the same global protections or recognition as others. So why is India hated? The reasons are complex and multifaceted. The lack of protective labels for Indians makes it easier for people to target them without fear of consequences. Media overexposure magnifies India's flaws while ignoring its successes, creating a distorted and negative image. And for some countries, using India as a scapegoat serves as a way to boost their own sense of moral or cultural superiority while conveniently ignoring their own flaws. In addition, the animosity toward India, especially in the West, has deep roots that span historical, political, and socio-cultural factors. The bias against India isn't just about present-day issues. It has been shaped by Cold War-era politics, economic competition, and even cultural differences. Let's explore the underlying reasons why India faces so much disdain and how these perceptions have been shaped over time. The legacy of Cold War biases plays a significant role in the modern-day perception of India. During the Cold War, India chose a policy of non-alignment, but it leaned closer to the Soviet Union than to NATO. This strategic positioning made India a target of suspicion from Western powers. In the years that followed, this Cold War bias continued to shape how India was viewed in the West. Institutions like the BBC and The Guardian, where leadership was largely shaped during that era, still hold on to these prejudices, portraying India through a lens of skepticism and mistrust. Even as the world has changed, the echoes of this historical narrative continue to influence Western attitudes toward India, often framing the country as a place of conflict, poverty, and instability rather than as a rising global power. Moving into the present day, economic anxiety and job resentment contribute significantly to the animosity toward India. Over the years, many Western countries have blamed India for the outsourcing of jobs, especially in the tech sector. The rise of skilled Indian workers, particularly under the H-1B visa program in the United States, has triggered a replacement fear among certain groups, especially in white-majority countries. This anxiety is rooted in the idea that Indians are stealing jobs from locals and contributing to economic decline. Furthermore, Indians, particularly in the U.S., tend to represent some of the highest earning demographics, exacerbating resentment. The success of Indian communities in fields such as medicine, engineering, and technology has led to feelings of envy and competition, much like how Jewish communities in history have been resented for their prosperity. This resentment isn't limited to the West. In regions like Uganda, Kenya, and South Africa, the economic success of Indian communities has led to backlash, even resulting in violence in some cases. In Uganda, for example, the wealth of the Indian community led to their expulsion by Idi Amin in the 1970s, highlighting how economic success can provoke hostility in various parts of the world. Another significant factor is India's foreign policy neutrality. India has long maintained a pragmatic foreign policy that avoids aligning too closely with any global power. While this has been beneficial in allowing India to maintain its autonomy, it also frustrates many countries. India's ties with Israel, for instance, anger many Muslim-majority nations, while its partnership with Iran irritates both Arab countries in the West. Furthermore, India's relationship with Russia raises concerns for the United States, and its growing collaboration with the U.S. frustrates non-Western countries. India's neutrality often leaves other countries unsure whether to view it as a friend or foe, creating an environment of distrust and frustration. While this approach has allowed India to maintain a strong degree of independence on the world stage, it also makes the country a target of suspicion from multiple sides, with countries unsure of where India stands in global power dynamics. This sense of distrust and frustration is compounded by the rising power of India and the resulting Western insecurity. Historically, whenever a country rises to challenge the dominance of Western powers, it becomes a target of criticism. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union was the prime target, and in the 1980s, Japan's economic boom was seen as a threat to Western supremacy. In the 2000s, China's rise to power sparked similar fears, and now, India is facing the same skepticism. India's rapid economic growth, its increasing influence in global affairs, and its independent foreign policy make it a natural target for Western critics. This is particularly true as India continues to establish itself as a global leader with its growing role in technology, space exploration, and geopolitics. The skepticism from the West often comes in the form of undermining India's achievements or exaggerating its challenges, a tactic used throughout history whenever countries rise to challenge the existing global order. Lastly, a significant portion of the hatred toward India stems from social and cultural frictions. On online platforms like Reddit and Twitter, much of the hostility directed at India is rooted in cultural misunderstandings or deeply ingrained. Many Westerners and even people in other parts of the world often view Indians through a narrow and inaccurate lens. Cultural differences are exaggerated and often reduced to simplistic, negative stereotypes. Indians are frequently ridiculed for their accents, their food, or their cultural practices, and these jokes often perpetuate harmful biases. These stereotypes are not based on any real understanding of Indian culture, but on ignorance and the lack of exposure to the country's diverse society. Online spaces, where anonymity fosters extreme views, amplify these misunderstandings and allow them to spread more widely. In conclusion, the hatred toward India is multifaceted and deeply rooted in a combination of historical biases, economic competition, and cultural misunderstandings. From the lingering impact of Cold War politics, the economic resentment of outsourcing and immigration, to India's neutral foreign policy and its rise as a global power, all these factors contribute to the complex and often hostile relationship that India shares with certain parts of the world. While some criticism of India may be justified, much of the hate reflects deeper biases, double standards, and the tendency to scapegoat an entire nation to deflect attention from one's own issues. To combat this kind of prejudice, we need to acknowledge these patterns and challenge the normalization of anti-Indian sentiment in global discourse. To truly understand animosity, it is essential to recognize these historical, political, and socio-cultural dynamics, and challenge the narratives that perpetuate prejudice against India. This will allow for a more nuanced and balanced view of India's role on the global stage, free from the biases that have shaped perceptions for so long.